everyone, welcome to episode 8 of HorrorHouse. I am Morgan, your host as always, and today it's just me. There's no guest on this week's episode, and that is for a reason, and that reason I will tell at the end of this episode. So yeah, this episode is probably going to be a little bit shorter than usual, and it's going to be more of a personal ramble about why I love this genre. You know, why I started doing this podcast, how I grew up with the genre, and why I have come to love it as I do today. As well as that, if you are currently on my YouTube channel, you should see a couple videos there, a couple different videos. And I'm going to talk about what that's all about at the end too, because I am very excited about some stuff that I'm doing with this channel. Some more stuff will be on there rather than just the podcast, and yeah, I'm very excited about that, and hopefully anyone listening is also somewhat excited. So yeah, this episode is all about why I love this genre, and I wanted to tell somewhat of a little story of, should we say, Morgan's horror journey. That sounds alright. So yeah, I actually do recall what the first horror film I ever watched was, and it's gonna be one that no one would expect. It's gonna be one that barely anyone would have heard of, probably. It is from 1939, and it's a horror comedy called The Gorilla. It stars Lionel Atwill, Bela Lugosi is in it, and the Ritz brothers. Yeah, it's watching it back later on in life. See, I was quite young. I was too young to realise how garbage this movie actually is, but watching it now, or watching it like the last time I watched it, which was, to be honest, a few years ago, it ain't good, but it was my introduction to this genre, and that will, I have to live with that will never change. I just remembered, even at that age, now I don't exactly remember how old I was, but I know I was pretty young, probably too young to be watching horror, even though it wasn't particularly scary, but I remember enjoying the idea of watching people get scared and becoming scared myself for them. That is in a nutshell why I love this genre. There's a lot more that I'll go into, but yeah, basically that. And as twisted and weird as that first part may sound, enjoying watching people get scared, I think lovers of the genre will agree to an extent that is why some of us do love horror film. We enjoy watching the people on screen being scared, and then that in turn makes us scared for them, and that those feelings inside us are what make us love this genre, what makes this genre impact on us so much. So yeah, I think what turns a lot of people onto this genre is that idea of enjoying the feeling of being tense inside. It's adrenaline for people. Well, it is adrenaline, really, isn't it? But yeah, it's why people go to those haunted houses. It's why Halloween is such a popular holiday. People enjoy being scared, and people enjoy scaring other people or watching other people be scared. It seems natural to a lot of people. And especially to horror fans, we enjoy that feeling. But having said all that, my first introduction to the genre, the gorilla, is not scary. It's not scary at all. It just isn't. It's a poor film, and I regret it being my introduction to the genre. But like I said, I have to live with that now, and I will. I will learn to live with that. It did have Bela Lugosi in after all, so that is the saving grace of anything. But yeah, so that was my first introduction to the genre, and yeah, that is why I do think people love this genre, because of that feeling of enjoying being scared for other people. It's weird. Now, after that, now, like I say, I forget quite how old I was, but after that, I grew up slightly. Maybe I was around 12 at this point. I think I was. I believed around this age that horror movies and horror as a genre was poor, was just almost a dead genre. Maybe not even dead genre, but just a genre that churned out garbage after garbage after garbage, and that was because I was 12 in the late noughties. I was 12 in 2009 was the year I turned 12, and the late noughties, or the late 2000s, however you want to say it, as anyone will tell you, was a terrible time for horror movies. We hadn't had a good one we hadn't had a legitimately good one for years. We were right in that stage of let's remake everything, and it was just, it pains me that I had to grow up as a relative horror fan at that time, because I can't imagine how big a horror fan I'd be if I'd have grown up in the mid 80s or even like the late 70s. It would have been insane compared to what I am now. Yeah, but I mean, in the late noughties, you were seeing nothing but poor reviews, poor responses to any horror that came out. So this sort of affected 12-year-old me, in the sense that I thought, oh, horror must be, garbage. It must be poor. Not knowing, of course, what I know now, or what I knew a couple of years after that. So, like, I remember thinking back then, surely it can't be this bad. Surely horror has got some sort of saving grace. Remembering that I had watched The Gorilla, years before, realising that, like, well, I hadn't watched that since my first viewing, but realising that, like, horror films date back to, I was realising to myself at this point, horror films date back to the 30s, at least. And I know, obviously, now they date back much earlier than that. But, yeah, so I'm thinking to myself, yeah, they can't be this bad. Horror can't be this bad of a genre. So, trusty Google was there, of course. I go on, I search horror movies. That was the turning point. That was the eye-opening point of this entire story. That would be the little kid sat in, that is the little kid sat in front of a computer screen going, wow, I've opened up something here. And essentially I opened up my love of horror at 12 years old, which may be a little bit young for, enjoying watching YouTube lists of top 10 horror kills, top 10 horror killers, best horror movies, whatever that would be. But I would spend ages and ages watching these lists on YouTube. I remember watching these lists of top 10 horror killers and all that. You know, being obviously introduced to Freddy, Jason, Ghostface, Michael Myers, all that sort of stuff. You know, I then thought, the 70s, 80s was where horror was at. I had no idea of going further back than then at age 12, 13. But yeah, I was still watching these lists, and around the age of around the age of 13, 14, I knew I liked horror then. I could, it was pretty clear. But I still wasn't watching a lot of horror movies, and thinking about it now, that was probably due to lack of availability. I couldn't go out and watch a horror film at the cinema. I couldn't go out and buy a horror film. I didn't have any money at age 13. I couldn't, I didn't know that I could illegally stream any movie. I wouldn't do that. I still don't do that now. That's something I don't do. That's something I will never do. But yeah, I knew I enjoyed the genre at age 13, 14, but like I said, I still wasn't watching a lot of it. Now, when I think of me being a film lover, me being a film geek, I think of 15-year-old me. That was when I first became serious about loving film, loving movies. Not necessarily horror, though. Horror had almost been forgot about in my mind at age 15. Now, I can recall this now. I don't know why horror had been forgot about, because I remember being a lover of horror at age 13. But it was mob movies, it was gangster movies that I, most loved around the time I started really getting into film. I would say for a good few years that Scarface with Al Pacino was my all-time favourite movie. That's not the case anymore. I don't think having a favourite movie is possible, but I remember I would say that. I love stuff like Goodfellas. Obviously I still do, but these were the huge ones. Goodfellas, Godfather, Scarface, Casino, Martin Scorsese's Casino I remember loving. Even The Departed. Scorsese was really the he's the go-to guy for mob movies anyway, but he was really my first sort of film love, the first director that I really loved when I first started getting into film was Martin Scorsese, and that was because of his mob movies. But yeah, horror had been completely forgotten, completely replaced by Scorsese, and that might not be a bad thing, I know, but still. Really, my serious love of horror, my serious love of horror started probably a year later, or maybe a year and a half later. At age 16 in Britain. Now, this is something US listeners may not understand, may not know. At age 16 in Britain, students go to college, somewhere called college. You have college is a thing in the US. Of course it is. That's where you go when you're 18 after high school in the US. But college in Britain is somewhere where you go from the ages of 16 to 18, and then you go to university after that. And I know all American colleges are universities, it's the same thing, it's just what we call college is different over here. But yeah, so at 16 I went to college. I took film studies at college as one of my 4 subjects I could take there. And film studies at college was the single best educational experience I've ever had. It was just phenomenal. It opened me up to so many different films. It introduced me to so many different films, and thankfully, in my first year there, we did a whole part of that year was dedicated to British horror and studying British horror. And that is what I have to thank for, well, specifically my film studies teacher, is who I have to thank for my love of horror as it is today, really. Because he introduced me to, I found myself really loving these old horror movies he'd show as reference points. And he would just talk about them. We would have such good discussions in that class and about horror, about British horror, and so I'm then going home afterwards, and I'm trying to get hold of as many of these horrors as possible, because this is when my horror and my love of horror has resurged again. I really don't know what happened at the age of 15. My love of horror seemed to just go. It went somewhere else. Horror wasn't part of my mind. But 16, we've passed that. Age 16, age 17, at college, in film studies, watching horror was, that was the reason. That is the reason why I am such a horror fan today. As you can tell, this episode is quite rambly and bizarre and all over the place, but hopefully that's still okay. Hopefully it's, even though it's slightly less coherent as one with a guest on would be. But yeah, these old horrors that my film teacher would show in film studies class would they'd mesmerise me, and I would go home and I would try and get a hold of as many of them as possible and watch them. And I watched them and I loved them. It's that simple. That was what properly introduced me to all the horror legends that we mention on every single episode of HorrorHouse. John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Bela Lugosi, Maurice Karloff, Peter Cushing, Vincent Price. Maybe not Price, actually. Thinking about it, I think Price came later. Yeah. Price, my love of Price actually came later. We'll get on to that. Yeah, but all the legendary directors, George Romero, all the legendary directors, all the legendary actors and actresses, I was introduced to properly thanks to film studies, and thanks to me going home after a day at college, trying to get hold of these films and watching these films and being introduced to these people. And yeah, that is really what did it. That is really what did it. I mean, there is stuff after that, of course, that has helped expand my love of horror, but that is really what did it. I have film studies at college to thank for my love of horror today, as it is. So, we still have a bit of this story into why I love horror to go, but let's get some plugs out of the way. If you are liking this episode, please give it a like, comment down below, please subscribe to this YouTube channel for more episodes of HorrorHouse, plus other stuff, and that's definite now, as you will see if you go onto my channel, and as you will see if you wait until near the end of this episode when I will have a couple announcements and updatey points. But yeah, if you are liking this, please like, comment, subscribe to this channel. You can follow the podcast on Twitter, and that is at HorrorHousePod. You can hashtag HorrorHousePod if you have any questions about any episode. You know, this is episode 8. Go back and listen to all 7 previous ones. If you have any questions at all, use hashtag HorrorHousePod on Twitter, and, you know, I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Pretty much right away, I would expect. Yeah, or you can tweet at HorrorHousePod too. You can follow my personal Twitter, which is at the Purple Don. That's with an N. You know, tweet me there if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics or future guests. You know, we've had a few guests on. A few of my good friends that have been good enough to come on this podcast so far. So if anyone else springs to mind, if you're a listener, if anyone else springs to mind who you think you would like as a guest, or if you yourself want to be a guest, please send me a tweet or a Twitter message, and I'm sure we can figure something out. I'd love to have anyone that's willing to talk for an hour about good horror on this show. Yeah, I think that's it for the plugs. Yeah, that is it for the plugs. Okay. Back to the story. This is like a real story. This isn't a real story, by the way. Well, it is, but it's not like written down. It is completely rambled. Yeah. So, from when I was 16, 17 in film studies class in college, my horror collection, I actually have my entire DVD collection right beside me at this point, and my horror collection has only grown and grown. It's expanded so much to all sorts of reaches, to, you know, silent horror, foreign horror, gothic, paranormal, slasher, horror comedy, you know, anything you can possibly, any little subgenre of horror you can possibly think of. I pretty much own at least a film in that little subcategory, and I own more horror movies than any other genre by far. I watch more horror than anything else by far, and that is what that is one of the major things that makes me love this genre, is its diversity. You know, the fact that you can have 2 completely different films. Say, you know, you look at Frankenstein, 1931's Frankenstein, right? And then you look at something like Scream. They're both horror, but they're just so radically different. You know, I think horror is the most diverse genre, more so than anything else. And that is what that is a major reason why I love this genre. You know, like I say, yeah, is its diversity, and the fact that you can have 2, 3, 4 totally different films, but they all fall under horror. You know, it's incredible to think. And, you know, which is why, you know, horror, which is why a love of horror can be so expansive. You know, you can love, like I say, you can love silent horror and you can love slashers. They're completely different, but it is just incredible to think that a genre can be so diverse, and like I said again, that is a major reason why I love this genre. And of course, I still love that feeling of tension and unease and weird excitement when watching a horror film. That is a feeling that I love, having my heart beat faster when a tense horror film's on. You look at, obviously the obvious one for this is Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween. You're not going to find a more perfect tension in a film than Halloween. And every time I watch it, I feel the exact same. It never changes, and I absolutely love that feeling of being tense, feeling uneasy at what's happening on screen. Like I said before, being scared for the characters is something I enjoy feeling, and I think all horror fans enjoy feeling. I think that's why people are horror fans, because like I said, because that's why they love that feeling. That's why people are horror fans. I know I am repeating myself a lot, but that is because this is a more rambly episode. This is a more personal story episode, and that is for a reason. That is for a reason, and that reason I am going to tell you at the end of this episode. But yeah, horror is the most easily identifiable genre, I think, even more so than comedy. Now, you can look at a film and know it's a comedy, but you can look at an image and know it's a horror. You can look at an image from a film, a still from a film, and you can say that's from a horror film. Where I haven't come across that. That's not a thing in other genres. But it is the genre with the most tropes, the most played out tropes, the most annoyingly boring tropes, and that is why a lot of people have a negative view of horror movies. Not only because they might scare them. This is a different kind of negativity, and a negativity which 12-year-old me was a part of. Whereas, saying horror was only tropes, it was played out, all that sort of stuff is what 12-year-old me believed. And while that is true, the most important thing to me for a horror film to be able to do is to use the tropes in an interesting way, in a different way. And I think if a horror does that, I think that's when you're onto something. That's when you've hit gold. Because horror needs those tropes. It needs the tropes in there. That's why they're in there. But you can change them about. They have been changed about loads, and they make for some exceptional films. And it, just because the tropes exist doesn't mean a genre can't be great. Yeah, that's something that I find. I wouldn't say annoying about people, but I think you know where I'm coming from. Is when people suggest to me now that horror is, a poor genre, a garbage genre. I keep using the word garbage for some reason. It seems like a nice word today. But yeah, it's why I like I say, I don't want to say annoyed, but when people say horror is garbage, it it doesn't go down well with me, because just because the tropes are there, just because the tropes are obvious in some horrors, you know, the bad horrors, it just so happens that, you know, whatever person may have seen a couple bad horror movies and just gone, oh god, this is terrible, I'm not going to watch horror, horror is poor. What can you do about that? But yeah, that kind of negativity is something I can't understand. The other kind of negativity towards horror movies is, you know, I'm too scared to watch horrors. I don't like being scared. I'm too scared to watch horrors, which is a perfectly reasonable thing. That is perfectly reasonable. That is perfectly acceptable. You know, no one's going to turn around and force anyone to watch a horror movie if they're too scared of doing it. And to be honest, thinking about it, that is another reason I love this genre, is its ability to make people not want to watch it. And while that may sound slightly weird, let me try and explain that a bit more. Horror is probably the most impactful genre, more so than comedy. Comedy can stay, you know, it can stay with you. Hard-hitting drama can stay with you inside for, you know, ages and ages. But I don't think there's any genre that can actually turn people off watching it due to the impact it's had on them. If a film scares you so much that you will never watch another film from that genre again, that film has done something incredibly impressive. You know? Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from with this. It makes sense in my head. Yeah, the fact that people will not watch horror because they watched one once and it scared them for life is an incredible thought. It just shows the power that horror has as a genre to create impressions on people, and that is what film is really, is there to create impressions on people. That is, yeah, thinking about that now, that is incredible to me. Anyway, let's move on, shall we? I think that pretty much sums up why I love horror. The little story of my life through horror movies, which doesn't make a great deal of sense. But yeah, the little journey of my life as a horror fan. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. But there is some more. Don't switch off just yet. There is some more to come in this episode yet. I decided to start this podcast back in May because, you know, no matter how much I wanted to talk about horror to, you know, anyone, to my friends, to whatever, most people would be just plain unwilling to listen to it because I would go on and on and on about all sorts of details. No one really cared, which is why I decided to start this podcast. It's a way of getting what I have to say about this genre that I love out there. It is a great way of doing that, I think. That's why I am carrying it on, and that is why, you know, no matter if I have one listener or 1,000 listeners, I will continue putting these episodes out there because I love doing them. I love talking about horror. The horror genre is one of the most important things in my life. which is why I decided to start this podcast. And now, my love of horror, I'm sure, will continue to grow and grow. My horror collection is bound to become bigger than a small room at some point. But yeah, that is why I love horror. And that is why I do this podcast. Anyway, now we're nearing the end of this shorter episode of HorrorHouse. Only shorter because it's just me, and shorter for a reason. And that reason is there will be an episode next week. Now, HorrorHouse has been coming out every other week since it started. But there will be an episode next week, next Sunday, and then it will start again every other week. But the reason there will be an episode next Sunday is because the Sunday after that, I am going to be appearing on Fan Friction, which is a show run by my good friends at the TUFF Channel. Be sure to definitely go check them out. I will leave a link in the description. So yeah, I am going to be appearing on their show Fan Friction, which is a film debate show, a movie fight, if you will. I'm going to be going up against two other competitors, and one of those will be the guest on next week's episode. One of my competitors on Fan Friction on September the 25th will be a guest on next week's HorrorHouse episode 9. So we're going to be building up to that Fan Friction match, and I think that's going to be a great episode. I'm really looking forward to having him on. But yeah, that is why there is going to be an episode next week and not the week after. But it will be HorrorHouse will be every other week from next week again, if that makes sense. Anyway, final announcement now, and biggest announcement, the announcement I'm most excited about out of any announcement I've ever made. If you go onto my YouTube channel now, which you will be on if you are listening to this, you will see a couple of videos that haven't been there before. I am developing this YouTube channel. I'm becoming more serious about putting out content on this channel, and I am going to be starting to do movie discussions, TV discussions, other stuff. I've got cinema trip videos, and as well as every other week another episode of HorrorHouse. But every movie I go and watch at the cinema, there will be a discussion on that. All the TV, there will be discussions on that. Movie news, there'll be discussions on that. I am going to be working really hard to put out these videos for anyone that's willing to watch, because I just think it'll be a great thing to do, and I'm so excited to start doing this. At the time of this recording, there are no other videos out on there, but by the time you're listening to this on Sunday or after Sunday, there will be other videos on there. And yeah, if you can't tell in my voice, I am very excited about this. I am very excited. It's something I've been looking to do ever since I started doing HorrorHouse, and yeah, I think it'll be fun. So yeah, please, again, if you liked this episode, please give it a like, give it a, comment something below, comment some of your thoughts on the episode, some of your thoughts on some of the stuff that's been said. Subscribe to this YouTube channel for all the new content that's going to be on here. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at HorrorHouse Pod to keep up with any updates on that. You can follow me on Twitter at the Purple Don to keep up with anything I have to say. You can hashtag HorrorHousePod on Twitter too, and that is for any questions you might have, any suggestions for future topics or guests. And yeah, that's about it. I hope anyone listening is excited about what I have to come, because I am, as I've said about 40 times already. So yeah, thank you for listening to episode 8 of Horror House. It has been a slightly shorter episode. Episode 9, like I said, will be with you next week, and I'm building this one up. I think it's going to be an excellent episode. So there. Thank you for listening, guys. Until next week, goodbye.